Thanks everyone for attending. My name's Brad Woodworth. I'm a postdoc researcher at the University of Queensland in Richard Fuller's lab. And today I'm going to talk about some of the work I've been doing, trying to understand how conditions in Australia impact shorebird populations in the Flyway. Is that true? There we go. So it goes without saying, especially at this point in the conference and for this audience, that shorebirds make some of the most spectacular migrations in all of the animal kingdom. And whether it's the Oriental pratt-and-culls from Northwest Australia or bar-tailed godwits from New Zealand that have been lighting up social media lately, or in this case, the Far Eastern curlew that Mint talked to us about early on in this session. They're truly fascinating spectacles of nature. But of course, as amazing as these migrations are, we know this type of lifestyle also creates its challenges for the birds. So across such a broad distribution as the Flyway, we can have a number of threats impacting these populations. So that could be climate change up at the breeding grounds, impacting habitat suitability or shifting habitat. It can be habitat loss or degradation caused by human activities elsewhere in the Flyway. And it can be things like chronic human disturbance or dog disturbance elsewhere in the Flyway. So as much as that's a challenge for the species themselves, it's also a challenge for the researchers that are trying to distinguish the population impacts of these different threats across the annual cycle. And so for all migratory species, not just shorebirds, there's a number of important questions, both that are scientifically useful, but for conservation as well. And so those are questions like, what are the relative effects of these threats from the different phases of the annual cycle? Where are effects the greatest? And also, what are the effects of conditions at any one location, given that the full complexity of this Flyway? Unfortunately, we know for a number of species that the cumulative or aggregate effect of all these challenges they face along the Flyway are these steep declines like we've seen for curlew sandpiper and Far Eastern curlew, for example. And we also know that loss and degradation of intertidal habitat in the Yellow Sea has been a major cause of migratory shorebird declines, at least for some species in this Flyway. But of course, there are other threats, and many of these threats are widespread, and we've learned about a lot of them from previous talks in this conference. And while they're widespread, sometimes their impacts can be quite challenging to detect. And that can be for a number of reasons. For example, maybe we lack time series of data, like lack time series data, for example, hunting. And then other stressors can be more subtle, like for example, the effects of dogs flushing shorebirds. While we know that that's going to have a cost, a physiological cost for individuals, how does that sort of scale up to the population? And so in Australia, where, and more specifically Queensland, where my work is focused, I would argue that many of these threats that shorebirds face here fall into the category of these sort of more subtle threats. But nonetheless, they could be having important aggregate effects as Australia does serve as the primary non-breeding grounds for a number of these species. And it's important that we're able to identify where activities in Australia are impacting these populations. The population in Australia is projected to grow quite substantially over the next few decades. And from what I know about Australians and people visiting Australia, those people, that population growth is not going to be happening in the red center. That's going to be happening on the beaches where these shorebirds are feeding and roosting. So to that end, then I sought to evaluate, a fairly basic but important hypothesis, which is that even in the face of strong remote pressures, non-breeding conditions in Australia are impacting migratory shorebird populations in the Flyway. And to do this, I adopted a comparative approach where I analyzed shorebird population trends across 3 coastal regions in Queensland, Australia, shown in the blue polygons on the right there. The northernmost being Mackay, the middle one being Great Sandy, and the southernmost being Moreton Bay, which is just to the east of where I'm sitting right now. An important sort of component of the study design was that these three regions really differ in terms of the amount of human pressure that they face and how modified the landscape is around them. So starting down in the south, Moreton Bay is on the doorstep of about nearly 3 million people. And as you can see from the map, the dark colors in the map on the right, it's a highly modified landscape, lots of human pressure. If we move up to Great Sandy, it's almost the exact opposite. Here we only have about 150,000 people, and you can see most of the colors here are yellow, suggesting that, or indicating that the landscape, it's relatively pristine, at least compared to Moreton Bay. Both of these sites, these southern two sites, are Ramsar wetlands, and both are marine parks. And then if we move up to the northernmost site, Mackay, well, it sort of sits somewhere in the middle. We have more industrial activity here. We have no Ramsar protection or marine park protection. And then we have a population that's a bit bigger than Great Sandy, but well below Moreton Bay. So to address this hypothesis, I extracted and analyzed non-breeding high tide roost data from 1993 to 2020. These data were meticulously collected by the Queensland Wader Study Group, which is a citizen science organization that's been, really at the forefront of shorebird conservation in Queensland for nearly 3 decades now. And so with this excellent data set, I was able to estimate regional and site-specific trends for 14 shorebird species, 11 migratory and 3 non-migratory. We estimated both regional trends, so trends at the whole level of each of these 3 regions, but also site-specific trends. So within each of these regions, there were 30 to 40 sites on average. So we estimated changes in population in shorebird numbers at each of those sites. And then to infer local impact, we sort of took a 2-step approach where we first just compared the regional trends across the 3 regions. And then second, we examined how much the site-specific trends within each region are deviating from the regional trends. That sounds a bit confusing, but I will unpack that a bit later on in the talk. But I think it's helpful first to see sort of the results of the regional trends. So moving on to that then. So this table here shows all 3 regions, and it shows the percentage of species within each region that had decreasing regional population trends, increasing, and no change. And just as a reminder, Great Sandy is sort of the area that is under low pressure, Mackay is somewhere in the middle, and then Moreton Bay is the highest. And so what sort of obviously jumps out here is that we see greater percentages of species decreasing in Great Sandy and Mackay compared to Moreton Bay, which is kind of the opposite of this human pressure gradient. You would probably, if you just were to quickly make a guess, expect that you'd see more species declining in the region that's under higher pressure. So why then aren't we seeing regional trends reflecting this sort of human pressure gradient? Well, to understand that, we sort of have to go back to some of the points I was sort of introducing earlier, and that's that regional trends are a product of impacts at multiple spatial scales. So to explain this, hopefully clearly, here we have the trend for Far Eastern curlew in Moreton Bay. So for the whole region, we can see that there's a fairly notable decline for this species. That regional trend is going to be a product of 2 factors. It's going to be a sum of sort of local effects. So here we have Moreton Bay, and all the shapes show different sites where they roost. And we can see that a large number of these are declining, indicated by the downward facing red triangle, but some are increasing, the blue triangles, and some are more stable. But then in addition to this, we also have these remote effects. So things like the impacts of habitat loss on the Yellow Sea, for example. So this makes it challenging to sort of separate these local effects from the remote effects. And that's especially true at this sort of sub-flyway scales or these regional scales, because we just generally don't know how to remote effects. Plus, we also don't know the amount of connectivity and mixing among the regions. So our is the shorebird community in Moreton Bay exposed to the same threats going up through the Flyway that the shorebird community in Great Sandy is? We don't really know this. So for that reason, then, we need to infer local impacts, we need to scale these site level trends by the regional trend to assess local impact. So that's what we did. We took all the site level trends, essentially subtracted the regional trend, and looked at how much deviation we see across the three regions. And this generates this prediction that the proportion of site level trends that are going to deviate from the overall regional trend will be higher in regions under greater human pressure and lower in less human modified regions. Or in other words, in more pristine areas like Great Sandy, we expect all these 30 or 40 site level trends to sort of approximate what's happening at a regional level, because most of the input driving trends here is remote. That's sort of the hypothesis or the idea. So what do we do when we calculate the site level deviation, or what do we find? Well, this figure shows on the y-axis the percentage of site trends deviating from the regional trend, and then on the x-axis we have the three regions ordered by human pressure. So low pressure for Great Sandy going up to high pressure in Moreton Bay. And what we can see is that, you know, on average for like Great Sandy, we have anywhere from 0 to 20% of sites are sort of significantly deviating from these regional trends. And as we move up the pressure gradient, we see that the proportion of sites deviating from the regional trend is increasing. So that matches our prediction. And it actually comes even more into focus when we exclude a couple of the non-coastal species. So pied stilt and sharp-tailed sandpiper, they're known to use inland wetlands quite frequently, and so the sampling regime used by QWSG doesn't necessarily capture their populations as well. If we sort of take them out, we see this increase in site level deviation with human pressure come into focus. Now, there are some exceptions, of course. Great Knot is one that stands out as being quite different. We'll have to look into what's happening there. I do know that Great Knots are much more abundant at Mackay relative to the other two regions. So to summarize then, based on this deviation of site level trends from the regional trend increasing with human pressure, we can conclude, or I would argue, that this is evidence that non-breeding conditions in Australia are impacting migratory shorebird populations. And so while this result doesn't go so far as to say, for example, that for far eastern curlew, 10% of the decline in Moreton Bay is due to Moreton Bay factors and 90% due to factors acting elsewhere, it does provide an important, it does have important implications for domestic conservation action, just in the fact that it shows that what we're doing here in Australia, in some of these important shorebird areas, is impacting these populations at a community and population level. So with that, I'll just thank a few people, especially the Queensland Wader Study Group and their many volunteers over 3 decades that have contributed to the counts that I've analyzed here. Thank you.